Have you ever stopped to think about what might be hidden behind a door that no one dares to open? They laughed at the cemetery caretaker when he asked for the keys to the chapel, abandoned 40 years ago. They called him crazy, obsessed, one of those stubborn old men who don't know when to give up. But when those rusty doors finally opened, the laughter died in everyone's throats. What was hidden inside would change that small American town forever, and reveal a secret that should have remained buried. Now answer me this. Do you believe that sometimes the quietest people, those we don't even notice in our daily lives, might be holding the most important stories? Because that's exactly what we're going to talk about today. Stay with me until the end, because what you're about to discover might surprise you in a way you never imagined. This is the true story of Harold Mitchell, a 67-year-old man who spent over 30 years tending to a cemetery in a small town in the United States. 2. Everyone around him, Harold was practically invisible. Just another employee doing his job, sweeping leaves, mowing grass, keeping the tombstones clean. Nothing special, nothing extraordinary. But Harold carried an obsession that consumed his thoughts every day. An abandoned chapel locked since 1984, covered in ivy and shrouded in mystery. Have you ever been through this? Ever felt that there's something important waiting to be discovered, but no one around you seems to care? Harold felt this way for decades. While the city moved on, while new generations were born and grew up without even knowing that chapel existed, he watched, he waited, and he prepared for the day when the truth would finally come to light. Because you see, it wasn't just an old chapel. Official records cited structural issues, but the town's oldest residents whispered other things. Stories about strange sounds echoing at night, about the last priest who served there and disappeared without a trace, about a ceremony that should never have taken place. And when the city council decided to demolish that place once and for all, Harold did something no one expected of him, something that would change everything. For the first time in decades, Harold raised his voice. He interrupted a town council meeting, stood before all those politicians and officials, and made a simple, direct request. Give me 48 hours. Let me open that chapel and show you what's inside before you destroy it. The entire room erupted in laughter, laughter of derision, of disbelief. How could that old caretaker have the audacity to interrupt a decision already made? But something in the determined gaze of that silent man made the mayor hesitate. And then, against all expectations, he agreed. Before continuing, I want to take a quick break here because I know this topic is affecting you just as it affected me when I discovered this story. Leave a comment below about what has touched you the most so far. Have you ever met someone like Harold? Someone everyone underestimated, but who held something important inside? Or perhaps you yourself have been that person. Share with me, because these stories connect us in a unique way. And look, I know you're feeling that connection with the content, so leave a like on the video. Your participation here is what makes this channel grow and reach more people with this kind of real story, one that moves you, inspires you, and makes us reflect on how many times we judge someone by their appearance or the position they hold. If you want to continue seeing stories like this, stories that touch the soul and reveal silent strength, from ordinary people, subscribe to the channel now and activate the notification bell. Because every subscriber who arrives here is not just a number, it's someone who believes that these messages need to be shared. And I'm counting on you in this journey. Now come back with me to the story, because what happened the next morning was something that no one in that city would ever forget. The following morning, a small crowd began to gather in front of Pinewood Cemetery. People who had never set foot there before showed up with their cell phone cameras, their skeptical looks, and the smiles of those about to witness a major failure. Part of the town was there out of genuine curiosity, but most, let's be honest, were there for the morbid amusement of watching old Harold publicly humiliate himself. After all, what could a simple caretaker reveal that would change anything? But here's what most people didn't understand about Harold Mitchell. At 67, after 3 decades tending to Pinewood Cemetery, he wasn't just a lawnmower worker cleaning tombstones. Harold knew every name carved in stone there, every birth date, every epitaph, every story of interrupted life. He knew who those people were, knew their families, had spoken with widows, embraced orphaned grandchildren, witnessed the silent grief of burying a loved one. To buy. Most people who passed him, Harold was invisible, just part of the landscape. A quiet man of few words who did his job and disappeared at the end of the day. But there is a transformation that happens when someone is ignored long enough. That person develops a special kind of attentiveness. Harold observed everything. He listened to conversations that people thought no one was listening to. He noticed details that others considered irrelevant. And during all those years, one thing consumed his thoughts. The old chapel of St. Mary, locked since 1984, covered in ivy and shrouded in layers of mystery. That silent obsession wasn't just curiosity. It was a personal journey Harold had been on for decades, driven by something no one around him could understand. While the city evolved, while new buildings replaced old ones and people went on with their lives without looking back, Harold remained there, faithful to his post, faithful to his undeclared mission. He knew there were hidden truths behind those rusty doors, truths that needed to come to light no matter how long it took. And you see, this mindset of quiet persistence is a rare thing to find these days. We live in a world where everyone wants immediate results, instant recognition, visible impact. But Harold was willing to wait. He was willing to be ridiculed, underestimated, forgotten, because he knew something that the crowd laughing at him that morning didn't know, that the most important decisions in our lives are often made away from the spotlight, in the background of existence where no one is paying attention. When Harold arrived that morning carrying his old toolbox, people began to record. He didn't say a word. He didn't make any dramatic speech. He simply knelt before the rusty chains that had held the chapel doors for 4 decades and began to work. Each creak of the metal echoed like a warning. Each chain that fell to the ground seemed to carry the weight of years, forced silence. And as Harold worked, something strange began to happen in the crowd. The laughter dwindled, the jokes died down, because even the most skeptical began to feel that they were about to witness something much bigger than they imagined. A blast of cold, dusty air escaped from inside the chapel as the doors finally gave way. It wasn't just the musty, neglected smell you'd expect from a place closed for 40 years. It was something heavier, denser, as if the air itself were laden with unresolved memories. The crowd instinctively recoiled. Some held their noses in their hands. Others simply stood paralyzed, feeling an inexplicable shiver run down their spines. And then came the silence. That kind of silence that only happens when everyone at the same time realizes they are facing something bigger than they imagined. Because you see, nobody really talked about why that chapel had been closed. If you asked the authorities, the city officials, the official records filed in the municipal library, the answer was always the same: structural issues. Simple as that. 2 vague and technical terms that shut down any deeper investigation. But if you knew the right people, if you had the patience to sit in the wooden chairs of the town's only bar and listen to the elders tell their stories, you would discover that there was much more going on behind that official explanation. The whispers were always the same, repeated in low voices, as if speaking louder might awaken something that should remain asleep. Stories of strange sounds echoing from the chapel at night, even after it was locked. Neighbors who lived near the cemetery swore that they sometimes heard what sounded like liturgical chanting coming from inside, even though there was no one there. Others spoke of faint lights flickering through the boarded-up windows, apparitions that could not be explained by logic or reason. But the most disturbing story, the one that made even the most skeptical frown, was about Father Thomas O'Brien, the last priest who served in that chapel. He disappeared without a trace in October 1984, exactly 2 weeks before the chapel was officially closed. There was no suicide note, no farewell letter, no transfer to another parish. Simply overnight, Father Thomas ceased to exist. His belongings remained in the sanctuary. His personal Bible was still on the table. Everything indicated that he planned to return, but he never did. And then there was that story that no one could confirm. But that everyone knew. The story about a ceremony that took place the night before the priest disappeared. A private, closed ceremony with important people from the city present. No one knew exactly what happened inside, but something changed that night. Something that demanded those doors be locked and never opened again. Harold knew all these stories. For 3 decades, while sweeping the dry leaves that accumulated at the locked entrance of the chapel, while mowing the grass around the ivy-covered walls, he listened. Cemetery visitors sometimes stopped to talk, shared memories, let slip fragments of hidden truths. Harold never asked directly, never pressured anyone. He simply offered his silent presence, a safe space where people could unburden themselves without judgment. And so, piece by piece, he assembled a puzzle that most people didn't even know existed. This journey of discovery behind the scenes of official history is fascinating because it reveals how decisions made decades ago continue to impact the present. How inconvenient truths can be buried under layers of bureaucracy and purposeful forgetfulness. But it also shows us that there is always someone paying attention, someone who refuses to let the past be completely erased. I sense that you've been following this revelation and want to continue discovering the secrets hidden behind those doors. Subscribe to the channel now, because what Harold found inside goes beyond any story you've ever heard. And when he finally crossed the threshold of that open door for the first time in 4 decades, what his eyes saw confirmed his worst fears and his greatest hopes at the same time. The interior of the chapel was exactly as it had been left 40 years ago. Wilted flowers, now turned to grey dust, still rested on the marble altar. Half-burned candles remained in the bronze candlesticks, as if someone had hastily extinguished the flames and never returned. The wooden pews were covered in a thick layer of dust that stirred with the influx of fresh air, creating ghostly swirls in the light filtered through the dirty windows. It was like stepping into a time capsule, a frozen moment that had patiently waited for decades to be rediscovered. But it was what came after that first glance that transformed curiosity into something far darker. Because while some people in the crowd began to timidly enter, their cell phones capturing every detail, Harold remained standing in the doorway, his face pale. His eyes fixed on something most hadn't yet noticed. Marks on the stone walls. They weren't just natural cracks caused by time or humidity. They were deep, deliberate, desperate scratches, as if someone or something had tried to escape, scratching with its fingernails with enough force to leave permanent grooves in the solid stone. And then there was the floor. The stone floor near the confessional was marked with dragged scratches, irregular patterns that suggested struggle, resistance, something violently repressed. The more people observed, the more disturbing details emerged from that scene frozen in time. A chalice overturned on the floor, its contents long since evaporated, leaving only a dark stain. Torn pages of a missal scattered, as if they had been ripped out in fury. And on the altar, open to a specific page, was a book with a worn leather cover, its edges burned as if someone had tried to destroy it, but gave up at the last moment. It was then that someone from the crowd approached the altar and read aloud the only handwritten sentence on that page. "Forgive me for what I have done." The voice echoed through the silent chapel, and a collective shiver ran through everyone present. Those 5 words carried immense weight, a confession without context, an apology without a clear recipient. Who had written it? Father Thomas before he disappeared. And for what exactly was he asking forgiveness? But look, what happened inside the chapel at that moment wouldn't have been possible if it weren't for a crucial decision made weeks earlier. Everything changed when the city officially announced that the old chapel of Santa Maria would be demolished to make way for a parking lot. The justification was simple: compromised structure, maintenance too expensive, abandoned property with no recognized historical value. A normal bureaucratic process, signed paperwork, approved funding, contractor hired. Yet another old building being erased in the name of progress. That's when Harold did something completely out of character for his quiet and reserved nature. For the first time in decades working at that cemetery, he raised his voice, literally. Harold took the only bus that went to the city centre, entered the city hall during an ordinary session, and interrupted the councillors in the middle of a discussion about the budget. People turned to look at that man in overalls, calloused hands and sun-weathered face, standing in the hallway as if he were about to commit the greatest folly of his life. And then he spoke. His voice trembled, but there was an unwavering determination behind every word. "Give me 48 hours. Let me open that chapel and show what's inside before they destroy it." The request was so simple, so direct, that for a moment no one knew how to react. And then the laughter began, first softly, then louder. The council members exchanged amused glances. The audience whispered. Who did that old man think he was, interrupting an official session with such an absurd request? But there is something powerful in a person who had spent his entire life silent and suddenly decided to speak. Something in Harold's determined gaze, in his firm posture despite the tremors, in the silent courage he had cultivated during 3 decades of patient observation, made the mayor hesitate. For a long moment, silence hung heavy in the room. And then, to everyone's surprise, including Harold's own, the mayor agreed. Harold walked straight to the confessional in the corner of the chapel, completely ignoring the crowd that now thronged the entrance with their cell phones raised, capturing every second of that historic moment. His footsteps echoed in the heavy silence, raising clouds of dust that danced in the rays of light streaming through the dirty windows. He didn't hesitate, didn't look to the sides, didn't show any doubt. It was as if he had rehearsed that moment 1,000 times in his mind, as if he knew exactly where to go and what to look for. The confessional door creaked as he opened it, a sharp sound that made several people in the crowd flinch. The small space was even darker than the rest of the chapel, a square of dense shadows where the light seemed afraid to enter. Harold bent down, his trembling but determined hands feeling along the wooden floor. And then, with a precise movement, he pressed a specific board that yielded with a dull click, revealing a hidden compartment that had remained secret for 4 decades. From within that hiding place, Harold retrieved an object wrapped in dark, mouldy fabric. When he brought it into the light, everyone could see. It was a diary. Not just any diary, but a heavy volume bound in worn brown leather, its pages yellowed with age but surprisingly preserved. On the cover, engraved in almost faded gold letters, were the initials T.O. Father Thomas O'Brien, the last priest of the chapel, the man who disappeared without a trace. The transformation in the atmosphere was immediate. The nervous laughter ceased completely. The side conversations died down. Even the most skeptical, those who had come only to mock the old caretaker, now leaned forward, trying to get a better look at what was happening. Because everyone, in some primal and instinctive way, felt that they were about to witness something that would change everything they thought they knew about that city, about that chapel, about the people who held positions of power. Harold carefully opened the diary, his hands visibly trembling now. The pages were covered in tight, urgent handwriting, as if the priest had written in haste, afraid of being discovered, aware that these words might be his last communication with the world. And as Harold began to read aloud, the first sentences sent a chill down the spines of everyone present. I witnessed a terrible crime. I saw men who should be protecting this city conspire to cover up a murder. I saw power and money buy silence and destroy lives. And when I tried to denounce them, when I threatened to take the truth to the authorities, they came to me. They threatened me. They said that if I spoke, it wouldn't just be my life that would be in danger, but the lives of everyone I loved. The revelations contained in those pages were explosive, devastating. The priest had documented everything with meticulous precision: full names, exact dates, details of private conversations, descriptions of secret meetings. He had witnessed a corruption scheme involving the former mayor, the police chief at the time, and several local businessmen. It wasn't just bribery or petty illegalities. It was something much darker, much more disturbing. The diary revealed that in September 1984, a 19-year-old girl named Sarah Brennan had died in circumstances officially recorded as a car accident. But Father Thomas had heard the confession of one of the men involved, had discovered that the death was not accidental, that there had been a systematic cover-up. That evidence had been destroyed and witnesses had been silenced. And when the priest threatened to break the seal of confession in the name of justice, when he decided that some truths were too important to remain buried, that's when everything fell apart. The mindset behind this type of decision is profoundly complex. Father Thomas faced an impossible moral dilemma: to respect the sacrament of confession or to expose a heinous crime. He chose the truth, and that choice cost him everything. But before disappearing, before being permanently silenced, he did something brilliant. He documented everything. He created a permanent record of the truth, hid it where he knew it would eventually be found, and trusted that someone at some point would have the courage to bring it to light. And that person was Harold. Because Harold wasn't just the cemetery caretaker. Harold was Father Thomas O'Brien's nephew. He was the young man in his early 20s who had visited his uncle days before the disappearance, who had received cryptic instructions about where to look if something happened, who had spent the last 30 years of his life patiently waiting for the right moment to reveal the truth. The cameras that had been there to capture the humiliation of an old caretaker were now broadcasting live one of the biggest revelations in the history of that small town. The videos immediately began circulating on social media, being shared from profile to profile, from group to group, spreading like wildfire. Within minutes, people who didn't even know where Pinewood Cemetery was located were watching Harold read excerpts from Father Thomas's diary, his words echoing across thousands of cell phone screens around the country. But the real transformation was happening right there, inside that chapel. Because as Harold continued to reveal the secrets documented on those yellowed pages, faces in the crowd began to change expression. Some visibly paled, others exchanged nervous glances, and some simply began to back away toward the exit, realizing too late that they were about to be exposed. Among those present were direct descendants of the men mentioned in the diary, sons, grandsons, nephews of people who held positions of power in that city during the 1980s. And now live, in front of dozens of witnesses and cameras, they were hearing for the first time sordid details about how their families built their fortunes, how they achieved their positions, about what hidden truths were buried to protect their legacies. There were also others in the crowd whose presence took on a whole new meaning with those revelations. A grey-haired woman who had entered the chapel out of casual curiosity suddenly found herself paralyzed when Harold read the name Sarah Brennan. Her legs went weak and she had to lean on one of the dusty pews. Because that woman was Margaret Brennan, Sarah's mother, the mother who had spent 40 years believing her daughter had died in a tragic accident, who had wept over a grave without ever knowing the whole truth about what really happened that September night. The emotional impact of that moment is impossible to adequately describe. Imagine carrying the pain of a loss for 4 decades. Imagine making peace with cruel fate. Imagine finally accepting that it was just a terrible accident, and then, suddenly, discovering that it wasn't an accident at all, that your daughter was the victim of deliberate decisions made by powerful men who thought they were above the law, that the justice you deserved was denied because of money and political influence. Margaret couldn't stand. She fell to her knees right there on the dusty chapel floor, sobbing in a way that broke the hearts of everyone present. But her sobs weren't just of pain. There was also relief in them. The relief of finally knowing the truth, the relief of discovering that her motherly intuition, that persistent feeling that something was wrong with the official story, wasn't paranoia or an inability to accept reality. It was maternal instinct recognizing that the truth had been manipulated. And Harold, this man who had spent 3 decades invisible, ignored, treated like part of the furniture in that cemetery, was now at the center of an emotional storm he himself had provoked. But he didn't stop reading. His voice remained steady, clear, determined, because he knew that this moment wasn't about him. It was about his uncle, Father Thomas, who had sacrificed everything for the truth. It was about Sarah Brennan and her family, who deserved justice. It was about all the other truths hidden behind the scenes of power that never come to light because ordinary people are afraid to challenge those who control the narrative. The diary contained more than just Sarah's story. There were other revelations, other crimes documented with meticulous precision, bribes involving public contracts where millions of dollars were embezzled, while schools and hospitals remained underfunded, threats against journalists who tried to investigate irregularities, even evidence of manipulation of local elections where votes were bought and ballot boxes were tampered with to ensure the right people remained in power. Each page Harold turned revealed a new layer of corruption, a new scheme, a new betrayal of public trust. And Father Thomas had documented it all, not out of revenge or personal ambition, but because he deeply believed that truth had intrinsic value, that some things are too important to remain hidden, regardless of the personal consequences. This, the mindset of prioritizing truth over personal safety, is rare to find, especially in a world where most of us learn from an early age that it's safer to remain silent, more prudent not to make waves, and smarter to protect ourselves first. I know you're feeling the power of this journey for truth and justice, so subscribe to the channel now, because what happened in the hours following that revelation was even more extraordinary. And as Harold finally closed his journal and looked at the silent crowd before him, he realized he was no longer alone in the fight he had waged silently for so many years. In less than 24 hours, the story had become national news. Reporters from major television networks arrived in the small town, setting up their tents and equipment in front of the cemetery. Investigative journalists began unearthing old files, interviewing residents who had remained silent for decades, and most importantly, the FBI opened a formal investigation. Federal agents appeared in town with search warrants, entering the homes of people who had long thought their secrets were buried forever. The speed at which everything crumbled was astonishing. Power structures that seemed unshakable, reputations built over generations, fortunes amassed through decades of manipulation, it all began to collapse like a house of cards. Because, you see, when you build your life on lies, no matter how solid the foundation seems, eventually the truth finds a crack and everything falls apart. Former Mayor James Morrison, now 83, was the first to be indicted. He had been a respected figure in the community, a man who supposedly dedicated his life to public service. But Father Thomas's diary revealed that he was the main architect of the cover-up of Sarah Brennan's death, that he personally ordered the destruction of evidence, that he threatened witnesses, that he used his position of authority to pervert the course of justice. When the agents knocked on his door, he didn't even try to deny it. He simply lowered his head and extended his wrists toward the handcuffs, as if a part of him was relieved to finally be confronted with his actions. Robert Chen, the former police chief, had a different reaction. He tried to flee. At 79 years old, with heart problems and difficulty walking, he actually tried to leave town in the middle of the night. He was found in a cheap motel 3 states away, alone, frightened, realizing too late that there is no place far enough to escape decisions made 4 decades ago. The transformation of a man who spent his entire life upholding the law into a pathetic fugitive in a dirty motel room was complete and devastating. And then there were the businessmen, those who had financially benefited from the silence, public contracts that were awarded not on merit, but through bribery, development projects that displaced entire families to benefit a select few, fortunes built not through honest work, but through corrupt connections and backroom deals. Many of them had already died, but their heirs now faced not only criminal investigations, but also civil lawsuits from families who were harmed decades ago. But here's something fascinating about how the truth operates when it finally comes to light. It not only punishes the guilty, it also liberates the innocent. Because Father Thomas's diary didn't just contain accusations against the powerful, it also mentioned people who tried to do the right thing, who tried to denounce wrongdoing, who were silenced or discredited. One of those names was Michael Torres, a young police officer in 1984, who had been dismissed on fabricated misconduct charges after questioning inconsistencies in the Sarah Brennan accident report. Michael had spent the last 40 years carrying the shame of that dismissal, unable to find another job in security. Watching his reputation destroyed, his career ruined, his life diverted from its intended course. And now, at 65, the pages of that diary finally vindicated his position. They proved he was right, that he had been punished not for misconduct but for integrity, that his life had been sacrificed because he dared to question those in power. Michael's redemption was public and emotional. The city held an official ceremony apologizing, restoring his reputation, and offering financial compensation that could never truly make up for 4 decades of injustice. But more important than any money or official statement was the moment Harold and Michael met for the first time, 2 men who had been silenced in different ways, who had waited patiently for the truth, who could finally look at each other and know they weren't crazy, that they weren't wrong, that justice, though late, had finally arrived. And Margaret Brennan, the mother who had wept over her daughter's grave. For 40 years without knowing the whole truth, finally got her answers. They weren't the answers she wanted. They were infinitely more painful than that. But they were the truth. And the truth, however painful, allows real healing to begin. It allows us to make peace not with an edited version of reality, but with what really happened. The chapel was not demolished. On the contrary, it became the city's most important project. Donations began to arrive from all over the country, people who had been touched by the story of courage and perseverance, wanting to contribute to preserving that place where truth had finally prevailed. Architects offered to work for free on the restoration. Artisans specializing in historical buildings traveled from distant states to help restore that sacred space to its original dignity. But the restoration wasn't just physical. The community collectively decided that the chapel needed to become more than just a beautiful building. It needed to be a permanent reminder of lessons that couldn't be forgotten. A memorial not only to Father Thomas O'Brien and Sarah Brennan, but to all the truths that are buried, to all the voices that are silenced, to all the ordinary people who dare to challenge corrupt power structures. During the reopening ceremony, 6 months after that transformative day, hundreds of people gathered. But this time, the atmosphere was completely different. There were no mocking laughs, no cameras seeking to capture humiliation. There was respect. There was gratitude. There was a shared sense that something profoundly important had happened in that place. The restored chapel gleamed in the afternoon sun, its repaired stained glass windows projecting colorful patterns onto the carefully restored wooden pews. Margaret Brennan was there, of course. She had worked personally with the memorial designers, ensuring that her daughter's story was told with dignity and truth. A bronze plaque now marked the spot where the diary had been discovered, its words simple yet powerful. Truth may be buried, but it never dies. It waits patiently for someone brave enough to bring it to light. And Harold, the man who had started all that transformation, stood beside Margaret, his hand resting gently on her shoulder. He hadn't sought fame or recognition, even now with reporters wanting to interview him, with offers of books and documentaries. Harold remained fundamentally the same quiet, humble man he had always been. The only difference was that now, when people looked at him, they truly saw him. They saw not just a cemetery caretaker, but a guardian of truth, a man who had honored his uncle's memory through decades of patience and quiet determination. During the ceremony, Harold was invited to speak. He hesitated, never having been comfortable with public attention. But when he finally ascended the restored pulpit, his words were simple and profound. My uncle taught me that some truths are too important to be forgotten, no matter how much fear we feel in revealing them. He paid the ultimate price for that belief. I merely carried the baton he passed to me. But this chapel, this memorial, is not about me or about him. It's about all of you. It's about a community that chose to confront its painful past rather than continue living a comfortable lie. It's about deciding that integrity matters more than convenience. The impact of those words resonated far beyond that small town. The story of Harold and Father Thomas became a case study in journalism schools about the importance of preserving the truth. In law schools, about how justice systems can be corrupted and eventually corrected. In ethics seminars, about the impossible moral dilemmas that people of faith sometimes face. Their journey became an inspiration to countless people around the world who struggled with their own hidden truths, who wondered if it was worth risking everything for honesty. The chapel now houses a small museum dedicated not only to its own history, but to similar stories from across the country, cases where the truth was suppressed, where ordinary people found extraordinary courage, where delayed justice still brought healing and transformation. Students visit regularly, learning lessons about integrity that no textbook could teach as effectively as that physical space where it all happened. And Harold continued his work at the cemetery. He refused offers of early retirement. He refused more prestigious positions, because for him that work was never about status or recognition. It was about honoring those who had passed, about keeping their stories alive, about ensuring that no important truth was lost to oblivion. I know you feel that this message about courage, truth, and justice resonates with something inside you, so subscribe to the channel now, because stories like this remind us of the power each of us has when we decide that truth matters more than our own safety. And the ultimate legacy of this extraordinary journey goes far beyond what anyone could have imagined that day when Harold asked for 48 hours to open an abandoned chapel. 3 years have passed since that transformative day, and what has happened in that time demonstrates how a single act of courage can create waves of change that spread in unpredictable ways. The entire city underwent a profound metamorphosis, not only in its physical structure, but in its very collective soul. Young people, who had grown up accepting that corruption was simply part of political life, now demanded transparency and accountability from their leaders. City council meetings that used to attract a handful of bored people were now packed with engaged citizens, asking tough questions, refusing to accept evasive answers. The community's mindset shifted from passive acceptance to vigilant activism. People learned through Harold's example that ordinary individuals have power when they choose to use it. That you don't need to be rich, famous, or politically connected to make a difference. You just need the courage to stand up for what's right, even when everyone is laughing at you, even when the odds seem impossible. But perhaps the most profound impact was on the conversations that began to take place behind the scenes of everyday life. Families that had kept secrets for generations began to open up. Children finally asked their parents about inconsistencies in family stories. Grandchildren began to question the origin of inherited fortunes. And surprisingly, many of these painful conversations led not to division, but to healing. Because the truth, even when uncomfortable, creates a foundation upon which genuine relationships can be built. Sarah Brennan, the young woman whose death had been covered up, became a symbol far beyond that small town. Scholarships were created in her name for students interested in investigative journalism and social justice. Her photograph, hanging at the entrance to the chapel memorial, showed a 19-year-old girl with bright eyes and a hopeful smile, frozen forever in a moment before her life was stolen from her. Visitors often stopped before that photo, some with tears streaming down their faces, others simply in reflective silence, all recognizing that she represented countless other victims whose stories are never told, whose justice never arrives. Margaret Brennan found a new reason to live through all that resurfaced pain. She became a tireless advocate for families of victims of unsolved crimes, traveling the country sharing her story, encouraging others to never give up the search for truth. Her transformation from a silently grieving mother to an active force for social change was inspiring. She often said in her lectures, 40 years is a long time to wait for justice, but it's never too late for the truth to matter. Michael Torres, the former police officer who had been vindicated by the revelations, also found a new purpose. He began working as a consultant for police departments around the country, helping to implement whistleblowing systems that protect officers who speak out against corruption. His journey from public disgrace to complete redemption has become a case study on the importance of protecting those who have the courage to challenge the culture of silence within institutions. And what about the guilty parties? James Morrison died in prison at 85, 2 years into his 15-year sentence. Some argued he deserved more time, others that justice came too late to truly matter. But Harold had a different perspective on it. He said in an interview, "It's not about revenge, it's about truth." Morrison spent his last years knowing that everyone finally knew the truth about who he really was. That's his own form of justice. Robert Chen, the former police chief, accepted a plea deal in exchange for testifying against others involved in the corruption scheme. He spent 18 months under house arrest and the rest of his life carrying the public weight of his decisions. His own children stopped speaking to him. His wife of 50 years filed for divorce. The social empire he had built completely crumbled, proving that some consequences go far beyond court sentences. The businessmen involved faced a mix of criminal and civil proceedings that they dismantled family fortunes built on corrupt foundations. Some tried to claim they were unaware of the extent of the illegality, that they were merely businessmen seizing opportunities. But Father Thomas's diary documented conversations that proved knowledge and active participation. The truth, meticulously preserved for 4 decades, left no room for plausible deniability. Harold Mitchell turned 70 last year. He still works at Pinewood Cemetery, still sweeps the fallen leaves from the tombstones, still knows every name carved in stone in that sacred place. But now, when people pass by him, they stop to talk. They ask for advice. They share their own stories of unresolved injustices, of truths that need to be told. And Harold listens with the same silent patience he has always had, but now his words carry a weight that comes from someone who has proven that persistence, even when it seems like madness to others, is actually the purest form of courage. The most profound lesson of this story isn't about conspiracy or corruption. It's about something far more fundamental to the human experience. The importance of not judging people by their appearance. How many times do we pass someone and assume we know everything about them based on their looks, their job, their social standing? How many Harolds are there around us, carrying important stories, guarding essential truths, patiently waiting for the right moment to act? And how many times, out of haste or prejudice, do we render them invisible? This transformation in how we view ordinary people is perhaps the most lasting legacy of all. That happened because Harold taught us that heroism doesn't necessarily look like what we see in movies. It's not always dramatic, loud, or instantly recognizable. Sometimes heroism is a 67-year-old man asking for 48 hours to open a door. It's 3 decades of silent patience. It's believing in something when everyone else says you're wrong. It's carrying a burden alone because you know that eventually, somehow, the truth will matter. And the truth about truths is this: they are incredibly resilient. You can bury them under layers of official lies. You can lock doors and throw away the keys. You can threaten and silence those who know too much. But truth has an almost living quality. It waits. It persists. It finds cracks in the most solid foundations. And when it finally emerges, when someone brave enough brings it to light, it transforms everything it touches. Father Thomas O'Brien's diary is now preserved in a special glass case inside the chapel memorial. Visitors can see it, though they cannot touch it. Its yellowed pages, his urgent handwriting, those words written in despair and hope at the same time, all preserved as a testament to how some decisions resonate through decades. The priest's decision to document the truth, knowing it could cost him his life, created a chain of events that eventually brought justice to people who weren't even born when he wrote those words. And this raises a fascinating question about the impact of our own decisions. How many choices do we make today whose consequences will only be fully understood years or decades in the future? When we decide to speak or remain silent, when we choose convenience over integrity, when we opt to look the other way instead of confronting what is wrong, we are creating ripples that go far beyond what we can see at that moment. Harold often speaks to groups of students who visit the memorial. He never planned to become a public speaker, never imagined he would spend his final working years sharing his story instead of just tending to the cemetery. But he accepts this new responsibility with the same humility that has characterized his entire life. And there's one thing he says in almost every talk, something that resonates deeply with those who listen. My uncle wasn't perfect, I'm not perfect, but we both believed that truth is worth more than our own safety. And if each of us did just one courageous thing in our lives, one thing where we put what is right above what is convenient, the world would be radically different. This mindset of everyday courage, of small acts of integrity that accumulate into massive transformation, is something our culture often underestimates. We live in an era obsessed with dramatic and instantaneous changes, with viral sensations and sudden revolutions. But Harold's story reminds us that some of the most profound changes come through quiet persistence, through refusing to give up, even when no one is paying attention, through fidelity to principles when it would be much easier to simply move on. So that's it. The story of Harold Mitchell, Father Thomas O'Brien, Sarah Brennan, and a small town that learned that the truth always matters, no matter how long it takes to come to light. And look, if you've made it this far with me to this final moment, it's because this story touched something real inside you. Maybe you're someone who also feels invisible sometimes. Maybe you're carrying a truth that needs to be told. Or maybe you simply believe, as I do, that there are profound lessons hidden in the stories of ordinary people who do extraordinary things. I feel you felt that connection. Leave a comment below writing, "I'm with you until the end." I want to know that you were with me on this whole journey, that these words aren't just echoing in the void, but reaching real people who understand the value of what we just shared together. And if this story really moved you, if it made you think differently about the people around you or about your own ability to make a difference, leave a like. It's not just a button. It's you saying that this kind of content matters, that real stories of courage and transformation deserve to be told and shared. And if you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, now's the time. Because every week I bring you stories like this, stories that most people have never heard, but that have the power to completely change the way we see the world and our place in it. Stories of ordinary people who made extraordinary choices. Hit that subscribe button and activate the bell because you won't want to miss what's coming. By the way, there's a video right here that perfectly complements this topic, a story about another person who everyone underestimated until the moment she proved she was right all along. Click and stay with me there, because I guarantee you'll leave that video as impacted as you left this one. See you in the next video. And always remember, never underestimate those who are silent. Sometimes those are the very people who hold the most important stories.